Some say that dating a native speaker is the ultimate shortcut to fluency. You'll learn effortlessly with a teacher always by your side, but is learning Chinese with a partner really the silver bullet it's often made out to be? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about love and language learning. Without going into too much personal detail, I've had my fair share of language learning with a Chinese partner, and while this doesn't mean that I know everything about the topic, I want to dispel some myths and clear up some common misunderstandings. I also want to share my experience of learning Chinese with a partner, which can hopefully benefit others who are in a similar situation. First things first, one of the most annoying things is when somebody says, "Oh, so that's why your Chinese is so good," when they realize that your partner is Chinese. However, we don't learn languages by marrying people, just as we don't learn a language simply by moving to the country where it's spoken. Naturally, it's easier to learn Chinese if everybody around you also speaks the language, but it's perfectly possible to live in China for a long time and still not learn Chinese, because it's about what you do, not where you live. And in the same manner then, it's not about whom you're married to, but what languages you speak in your relationship. The short answer to the question of how I learned Chinese is that I've engaged with the language for tens of thousands of hours, something which is clearly easier to do if you live with a Chinese-speaking person or if you are in an immersion environment, but as I said, that's not a guarantee. Most couples I know where one person speaks Chinese don't even use Chinese in their relationship, and then of course it doesn't matter whom you're married to. The long answer to how I learned Chinese is something I spent 7 podcast episodes covering, and it starts in episode 128 if you're interested in hearing my story. But let's continue discussing learning Chinese with a partner. The problem here, at least from a language learning perspective, is that most people don't form relationships purely to learn languages. And I mean, that's a good thing, but in case you are trying to learn Chinese, it might not be as straightforward or easy as you think. Since people want to communicate with each other, they tend to gravitate to the language which is the strongest one they share, which is probably English, unless you've been studying Chinese for quite some time. This does in fact describe my situation. I had studied Chinese for full time for more than 4 years when I met my wife, so causality goes in the other direction here. We got together probably partly because I already spoke Chinese at a fairly advanced level. So the challenge here is that if Chinese is not the strongest language you share, how can you make it so, or how can you improve your Chinese with a partner? As I already said, the crux here is that people want to communicate, so it's very easy to slip back into old patterns. If you're used to using English and that works, it's very easy to keep doing that because, well, you might want to learn Chinese, but you're actually more interested in, well, sorting out some issue, discussing an interesting topic, or maybe even having an argument. And then using those opportunities to learn Chinese, well, it would be good for your Chinese, but it might also be detrimental for your relationship. And I want to point out that that's fine. I'm not saying that you should sacrifice everything for language learning. This is simply meant as a discussion for if you want to get more language out of your relationship. Because I also do believe that in the very long run, making sure you learn your partner's language can be very beneficial and can build a very strong relationship. So assuming then that you're not already speaking Chinese with your partner, how can you start doing so? The first hurdle is that it can be very frustrating, both for you and your partner, to downgrade your communicative ability. You both know that if you use English, you can perfectly well deal with this, but now you need to do this in Chinese, which takes much longer and also with a worse result. My first piece of advice is to talk about this openly and regularly. Some people are very willing to share their language with their partner and might have a lot of patience, and they might even be good at teaching the language, but this is not guaranteed. Like I said earlier, most relationships are not formed primarily for language learning reasons, and you can not count on your partner being willing to do this. And even if they are willing, they might simply not be very good at it, or not have the patience, or lose interest after a week or two. I'm very lucky in this case because both my wife and I are language teachers, and so we care about these things and want to improve, but that is far from normal. Even so, we struggle to speak more Swedish, which is something we've been wanting to do all along. But because Swedish is our third strongest language after Chinese and English, this is incredibly hard. And that's something I'm saying after being fully aware of what the problem is and that we both want to fix it. That's not a guarantee. It's still hard to do, and you need to invest effort into doing that. And that's something you will need to do together. Moving on, I want to address a question that often comes up when it comes to learning languages with a partner, and that is if your language will be weird if you learn from your partner. After all, they speak in a certain way, and it might not be appropriate for you to speak in that way for various reasons. Chinese is not a language where many differences are formalized, so for example, we don't have different verb endings depending on gender and things like that in Chinese, although there are of course different words that are more often used by women and certain intonation patterns might be more common and so on, just like it is in most other languages. However, I don't think this is a serious problem. You are not going to learn Chinese only from your partner. You are hopefully listening to other people speaking, and you will also talk Chinese with people who aren't your partner. And this varied input will help you find a Chinese voice that suits you. Another question I've seen a few times is if it's good to learn from a partner who dumbs down the language to make sure that you understand. So in other words, you are talking with your partner in Chinese, but since your Chinese is not very good, they slow down, they use simpler words, simpler grammar, and so on. And is this really a good thing? Will this influence your long-term learning, and will you end up sounding like a child? This is, in my opinion, a non-issue. The most important thing is that you understand, and if that requires simpler words and simpler grammar, that's fine. As you learn more, your partner will naturally expand and use less simple words, less simple grammar, and so on. I mean, they are native speakers, they are used to speaking with other native speakers, and as you improve the way they speak, will approach the way they speak with other people. Before I share some more practical tips on how to learn Chinese with a partner, let's talk about the benefits of learning Chinese with a partner, because I've been saying now that it's not guaranteed to be a benefit and that it's not as easy and effortless as people say and so on. But of course, learning Chinese with a partner has certain advantages, assuming then that you are using Chinese. Just like living in a Chinese-speaking environment makes it easier to access and engage with the language, living with a Chinese person has the same effect, and it can be argued that it's more powerful because, well, you live with a person, you don't even need to go out to engage with the language. Meaningful exposure and engagement over time is also immensely helpful. That's how we learn languages, and this will be much easier to do if your significant other speaks Chinese with you. I would argue that this is true regardless of your Chinese level, because even very basic everyday conversations in Chinese will teach you something. For example, you will be constantly exposed to tones and how the syllables in Mandarin sounds and intonation and things like that. And over months and years, this will give you a solid foundation for your own Chinese. It is not necessarily enough for you to develop at a pace that you're happy with, but it is definitely a benefit. As I discussed in a recent episode 233, about the 3 roads to mastering Chinese, having your social life in Chinese was one of the paths you could follow. Just for fun, I estimated how much time I've spent speaking Chinese with my wife so far, and arrived at 10,000 hours, roughly. That's of course just a back-of-the-envelope calculation. We've been together for 13 years, which is about 4,000 days, and if we've spoken for, say, 2.5 hours per day during that time, which is not unreasonable, you end up at 10,000 hours. It would be ludicrous to assume that this hasn't had an enormous impact on my Chinese ability. So before wrapping up this episode, I want to share a few suggestions for how to learn Chinese with a partner. So my first tip here, if you want to speak more Chinese with your partner, is to limit it in some specific way. It could be a specific time, say between 8 and 10 in the evening, or it could be a specific location, say you only speak Chinese in the living room and the kitchen, or it could be that you speak Chinese for at least 5 minutes when you start and then you switch to English if you want to. As your Chinese improves, it will be more comfortable for both of you to stay in Chinese for longer than 5 minutes, but by committing to at least 5 minutes, you get started. You can also do the complete opposite, namely to use Chinese whenever you can. So if you can say "this is tasty" in Chinese, then say that. And if you can say "thank you" in Chinese, do that. And use the language, whatever it is, and however limited it is, when you have an opportunity to do so. And your partner usually can figure out what you know and what you don't know, so they can do the same. This is slightly harder because it requires you and your partner to pay constant attention to this, but it can be very powerful if you're able to do so. My next piece of advice here is to remember that your partner is a person, not a tool and not a dictionary, and probably not a teacher either. You are probably much more interested in learning Chinese than they are in teaching it to you, and this is very important to keep in mind. In some situations, it might be possible to balance the equation a little bit by teaching your partner about your language, but of course it depends on what language it is and if your partner is interested in learning it. Next, I think it's a good idea to focus on meaning most of the time. So you're using Chinese to communicate. You don't necessarily talk about how things are said. You don't ask questions about tones all the time and so on. And if you do have language-related questions, limit those to specific sessions. Or don't bother your partner with those at all and hire a teacher to do it instead. This leads us to the next tip, which is to not only learn Chinese from your partner, and this is something I already discussed, but make sure you get varied input and also talk Chinese with people who aren't your partner. To conclude this article, I'd like to say that learning Chinese with a partner can be a wonderful and motivating experience, but it's not a silver bullet. Consistent exposure and engagement is what teach you Chinese, and there are many ways to do that, and having a partner is not a guarantee that you will get either. However, if you have a partner who is willing to speak Chinese with you, this can be very beneficial, particularly in the long run, and I hope that this episode has given you some ideas for how to avoid common pitfalls and also how to make the most out of language learning with a partner. And finally, remember that you care a lot more about learning Chinese than your partner, and that there is more to love than language learning. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.